Good day once again, learners. We're now looking at the activity related to the economic causes of the French Revolution. We've looked at the content, and if you recall, we said that the economic crisis was related to the financial problems France was facing before the revolution. We looked at the wars France was involved in, as well as the excessive spending by the government, and the problem with tax collection, where largely the third estate did not pay much taxes, and it was left to the burden of the poorest classes to contribute to the financial coffers, coffers meaning the treasury, or that branch of the government which is responsible for collection of taxes. These sources are in your addendum on page 3 of your resource pack. So let us look at the first source, which is labeled as source L, French finances in 1788. There is a graph there, and I'll be referring to the graph shortly, as well as on the right-hand side, you will look at the content or the text relating to the source. So what was the financial crisis according to the source? By 1789, France had entered into a period of financial crisis. Expenses exceeded income. In other words, France was spending more money than it had. The main problem it faced was how to raise enough money to meet the government's immediate needs. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, I'm referring to source L, this portion, the content. It says, this source, referring to the graph, shows clearly that expenditure significantly exceeded income. And to support that, look at this bar here. This is called a bar graph. And the values that are being showed here are indicated in what we call millions of francs. To the bottom, we have headings that are related to income, I beg your pardon, expenditure, income, and deficit. Expenditure is referring to how much the government spent on a variety of items or a variety of needs for the country and wants. So this included the spending on wars, spending for the royal family, spending on food, as well as all the other necessities that a country requires. The income refers to the amount of money the government was receiving, and this was largely coming from taxes. The deficit means the shortfall. In other words, the difference between what they had collected and what they had spent. So just as an example, if in your home, the income is 10,000 rands, in other words, put together the money that's collected from salaries, let's say from your mom and dad, and you've got a total income of 10,000 rand, but your family spends at the end of the month 12,000 rands, your family is spending 2,000 rand more than you actually have for the month. And that 2,000 rand is what is referred to as the deficit. So they go on to tell you in this text here, this had been an ongoing problem for years, especially since France had supported the Americans in the War of Independence against Britain. The only two ways to deal with the shortfall is the deficit, were to borrow money or to increase taxes. The French government had regularly taken out loans from foreign banks and governments, which meant that interest had to be paid annually on debt. By 1788, interest on loans was by far the biggest expense item on the budget. Now, what this tells you is that they had accumulated so much of debt, they were owing so much, they began to borrow. Now, you know, or you should know, when you borrow money from any source, it is usually accompanied by interest, whether it's a bank or a financing company. In this case, France was borrowing from other countries, foreign countries, and they charged an interest. So each year, France was not just paying for the loan, but they were expected to pay an additional amount, the interest. This escalated or increased the burden of debt tremendously. Okay, we go on to source M. This is what is called a pie graph. There are two pie graphs here. One is showing income and one is expenditure. And if you look at the left, the lightest shade is saying other. In other words, other sources of income. But the two main sources of income were direct tax. This here, direct tax was 28%. And most of the taxes came from indirect tax. This is indirect tax. So what's direct tax? In our country, direct tax would be, an example would be, your parent earns a salary of 5,000 Rand a month, and they expected to pay 300 Rand in taxes. In South Africa, that's called PAYE, pay as you earn. So that's direct tax. You're paying it directly to the government. And if you go back to the social causes, you might remember there was the gabelle and the taille, TAILLE. Those were direct taxes people paid on land and on salt, or on salt and land respectively, put it that way. Then what were indirect taxes? Now, indirect taxes came from other sources. For example, people paid the nobles for using the land. They paid in the form of performing labor, or they paid in the form of crops. In our country, an example of indirect tax is VAT. We pay for foods, but we don't pay for it directly. It is included in the cost of foods. So in France, the majority of people paid indirect taxes. Now, this was a problem because the government had no real structure or method of determining how much of money it was going to collect. It's easier to collect direct taxes because the employer then pays it to the government. With indirect taxes, it's a lot more complicated. Just to give you another example of indirect taxes in our country, we know that there are a lot of informal traders who do not pay direct taxes to the government. They are vendors on the streets. But the way they pay taxes indirectly is via foods, taxes paid on foods, or you may pay certain costs for certain services the government provides, like through your cost, like through your Home Affairs Department or through your courts, etc., etc. Now let's look at expenditure. So in other words, this looking at now this bar graph, sorry, this pie graph looks at a breakdown of what money, of how the money was used. Now the horrific thing about this is that half of the money, half of the income was spent on interest on debt. What that means is that the government was spending 50% paying just the interest on the money that it had borrowed, not on the debt itself. So the debt was not coming down. In other words, if the government had borrowed 100 Rand, just giving you a simple example, from another country, and was expected to pay 10 Rand in interest, the total the government would have to pay is 10 Rand, 110 Rand, sorry, 110 Rand. Now, the amount of money that the government kept paying was just the interest because it could not afford to pay the actual debt. It was paying the interest. Then it spent 26% on the Army and Navy. Now here it's looking at spending towards weapons, soldiers, uniforms, food, etc., for the defense of the country. That is an enormous amount. That's just over a quarter of the expenses. The civil service, you're looking here at your government, running of the government and government departments, cost 18%. And the royal court, in other words, the needs of the king and his royal family and the upkeep of the palace at Versailles, etc., cost 6%. So if you look at this, it's a flawed or faulty expenditure system because there's no real provision here for the needs of the majority, for services for the ordinary people, job creation, food, manufacturing, etc. And this was problematic for France. Right, your last source on this page, source O. The difficulty in France was that while there was a good deal of wealth in the country, the tax revenues could not be increased because the poor were already taxed to the utmost. So the 90% of the poor people were already paying high taxes, although they earned very little. So the government could not increase their taxes anymore, while the rich and even middle classes largely escaped. So they made excuses and they did not pay. Nobles didn't have to pay some taxes. Calonne's program had included a new land tax to be paid by all owners regardless of their class status. However, any such plan to disregard the difference between noble and commoner, in other words, the members of the third estate, was bound to run into difficulties, telling us that the nobles would never accept an increase in their taxes and that they would now be required to pay almost as much as the third estate in percentage terms with regard to taxes. So they would obviously object and resist this move by Calonne.